What would be going on in your mind if you were there? How would you react? What feelings would you have inside of you? Probably fear. Fear that someone is on the rampage and that you may be his next target. Fear that you may or may not escape in time. Fear that your friends may not be okay even if you made it out. Fear for your life. Fear of the gunman. Yet here at public universities in Texas, we are taught to fear a completely different category of people. People who have gone through extensive paperwork process and background checks. People without any felony or recent Class A misdemeanor convictions. People who, according to the Texas Department of Public Safety, are much less likely to commit a crime than the general population. People who would never ever dream of committing an atrocity such as mass murder. You would be more likely to die in a fire than be killed by these people. We are taught to fear the class of law-abiding citizens who peacefully carry a concealed handgun at almost every other unsecured location in Texas. We fear these people just like we feared them over 10 years ago, when shall issue concealed carry permits was hotly debated in the state legislature. People feared that these people would cause gunfights over minor traffic incidents or snap and go on a rampage at a moment's notice. Looking back, we realized that all the arguments against concealed carry, all the fear about the violence and the surge of violence if we let law-abiding people carry concealed were ridiculous. Those who support gun control or argue that the availability of guns and carry permits is a reason for violence and murder in this country. To quote Jon Stewart, their solution is, quote, "Then we must get rid of guns. Guns must go because that is the problem." Well, that is not the problem. You know what's the problem? Crazy is the problem. And you can't legislate crazy. Please welcome Dr. John Lott.
Well, thanks. I appreciate being invited here. I wish it was under different circumstances, but it's the basic issue that I was invited to talk about here. And you know, before I kind of get into the main part of this talk, I just thought I'd mention, you know, for the last 15 years, I've been doing a lot of work on multiple victim public shootings. And I probably have talked to more than 100 people at least who have been at these types of events, actually been present when the attacks have started. And the one feeling that you always get through overwhelmingly when you talk to people who have actually been there in that circumstance is kind of the feeling of utter helplessness that they feel. And it's quite understandable when there's no way for them to go and protect themselves when this rampage is occurring. You know, some people go and try to throw books or pillows or chairs or whatever that they have that's available to them, but obviously those types of things turn out to be... All right. Sorry. Sure. Yeah. Apologize. But obviously those things aren't equal to the harm that can be done from the guns. You know, guns make it easier for bad things to happen, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves and prevent bad things from happening. So, kind of before we get into the basic question here about campuses, I thought I would talk generally about the gun-free zone. Because in many ways, this has been a major discussion in the United States over the last few years with two big Supreme Court decisions that have come through, you know, overturning the DC handgun ban as well as the Chicago handgun ban. And what my research, not only in the new 3rd edition of More Guns, Less Crime has shown, but in my earlier books, is that I can't find a place in the world where we've had a gun ban and we have crime data both before and after this ban that we don't see at least some increase in murder rates. In fact, what we find, you know, is many times very large increases. But there's not a single case that you can find, that I believe you can point to, where there's been a significant drop in murder rates. And you would think, with all the places that have tried gun bans, at least they could point to one example where it's been successful. But, you know, and it's a question I kind of want you to think about generally, is about, you know, can you name one place where we've had a ban? Because, you know, bans on college campuses is really just a microcosm, one type of example of the types of bans that we have here. as I say, there's lots of experience with gun bans, gun-free zones. It's been the center part of Supreme Court decisions of recent years. You know, I think in the D.C. and Chicago gun ban cases, Americans generally understand what happened to murder rates after the bans went into effect, that they went up, and they went up fairly dramatically after the ban had occurred. The question is, why did that happen? You know, despite all the predictions, guns are bad, if we just take guns away, it's going to reduce it. And it's a basic question that's going to come up when we go more into this example here of gun bans on college campuses, and that is the question of who's most likely to obey these laws. I would argue that when you pass a ban, whether it be on a college campus or you're banning guns in a city or a country, it's basically the good, law-abiding citizens who are the ones who turn in their guns, not the criminals. And to the extent that you disarm law-abiding good citizens and not the criminals, you can have a perverse impact and actually increase the crime rates. And I suppose the simplest way to think about this, before we get into a lot of the data here, and that is, let's say someone was stalking you or your family, was really stalking your wife, let's say. Would you feel safer putting a sign up in front of your home that said, "This home is a gun-free zone"? Would that make you feel safer to go and announce that? My guess is most people wouldn't feel safer doing that. And the reason why they wouldn't feel safer for doing that is, I think, pretty obvious, because they'd essentially be telling the criminals, or that person who's stalking their family, that that criminal or stalker has less to worry about. That they don't have to worry about the people being able to defend themselves. And that rather than actually deterring the person with the weapon from entering the house, what it'll actually do is make it more likely that he'll do it. That these types of signs actually serve as a magnet for causing these types of attacks to occur. And what I would argue is that for places like the UT campus, we actually have these signs almost up in neon, essentially, telling everybody that when it comes to the University of Texas campus or other schools, that concealed handguns, that the potential victims that they face aren't going to be armed. Now, you know, we'll go through the data for DC and Chicago in a second, but there's some who go and argue that these aren't really fair tests. Gun control proponents say, okay, it didn't work exactly right, but that's because we didn't have a gun ban across the entire country. It was possible for criminals to go and get guns from other areas and bring them into the places where the gun ban is true. I would bring 2 points. One is that it would have been nice if they had shared it with everybody else that they didn't think that these were fair tests to have. But the second point is that these results, these increases in murders and other violent crimes, aren't just limited to Chicago and DC. Around the world, time after time, in places where the entire nation adopts these bans, or even island nations where they don't have any nearby neighbor that they can go and blame for being a source of guns, also see increases in murder rates and other types of violent crimes. You know, there are many areas of U.S. life where we have these types of gun bans or have had them. But often what I find when I talk to people is they kind of assume that whatever law is currently in place is the way the law has always been. So for example, after 9/11, I consulted a lot with the airline pilots unions about being able to have pilots carry guns on planes. And often in the discussion, you'd hear similar types of stories to what's being brought up now, where they'd say, well, you know, what happens if a pilot accidentally fires a gun? Or what happens if a pilot, you know, goes berserk, or what have you? Other potential hypothetical things that might occur. Well, my response, after working with the pilots unions, there's so many things that you find out that you just never knew were true. So for example, most of you probably don't know that all commercial airline pilots in the United States from 1924 up until 1963 were mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them when they flew in the United States. They were allowed to carry handguns with them up until 1979, where, according to the pilot unions, regularly about 10% of pilots still carry their handguns with them. And yet, with all that experience, over all those decades, the FAA has not one single record of anything going wrong with all those pilots carrying concealed handguns. You would think that there would be at least one story, but there's not. And so when people would bring up hypothetical cases about things that might happen, I thought the best argument would have said, well, what did happen when we had this experience? You know, things like whether we should have guns on college campuses. Most people think, well, because we have bans now, wasn't that always the case? And in fact, this is a relatively new phenomenon. These types of rules and restrictions only go back about 16, 17 years or so. Prior to that, there were no restrictions on virtually any college campuses around the country banning people carrying concealed handguns or other guns on campus. And in fact, a lot of states had right to carry laws, and people with those permits had no restrictions, whether they were faculty or staff or students, as long as they met the requirements and were able to carry the guns onto college campuses. And yet, prior to that period of time, despite all that experience in all those states, again, I can't find a single example of something going wrong on one of those campuses. Now, since then, we still have states, Colorado and Utah, have laws on the books that say that on public campuses, people can carry permanent concealed handguns. There are many college campuses around the country that are able to do, because most states leave it up to the schools to decide. But you know, there are probably most schools ban it when they have a choice for students. But my guess is, nobody's gone through this systematically, most schools allow faculty or staff to carry concealed handguns, because at least in the samples that I've been able to go through with faculty handbooks, you don't see restrictions applying to them that apply to the students. And again, as we mentioned, this is other countries. So what I thought I'd show you is just some data from DC and Chicago here. This is murder rates for DC relative to other cities in the top 50 cities. Before I go through this for a second, I just want to tell you a couple things. DC's handgun ban went into effect in February 1977 after a restraining order that had been imposed by the courts were removed. DC's murder rates in the year prior to the ban among these top 50 cities range from about ranked 20th to 15th. In the 30 years after the ban was imposed, DC's murder rate ranked number 1 or number 2 among the 50 largest cities half the time, and ranked in the top 4 2/3 of the time. So it was a dramatic increase, not only relative to DC's past murder rate, but also relative to other cities. This just compares the ratio of DC's murder rate to the average for the other 48 cities. Chicago's also dropped out just because it also imposes a ban, but including it because it's just one city has no real impact on these lines. DC's murder rate was falling relative to other cities prior to the ban. Basically goes down to about 10% above the other cities in '76. And then afterwards, it soars. I mean, it goes from about 10% above to about 45% above the murder rate in other cities. And it basically stays there afterwards. I could go and show you for periods of time after '87, where the reason why I showed you just this is, you know, 40, 50% increases here. They look tiny compared to how DC's murder rate soared relative to other cities after the crack cocaine epidemic hit. This is DC's murder rate relative to Maryland and Virginia. You can see it's rising afterwards. There's no year after the ban where it's lower than it was before the ban. And again, this is continuing out. This is DC's murder rate relative to the US, and again, carrying out. Now, one thing that's gotten very little attention is, while people may understand how DC's murder rate went up after the ban, there's almost no coverage about how it's fallen after the Supreme Court struck down the ban. About 2 weeks ago, the FBI came out with its new uniform crime report numbers for 2009. And what you can see is that last year, Washington, D.C.'s murder rate fell by 23% compared to 2008. Nationally, murder rates fell by about 7%. If you look at just cities over 500,000 in population, which would be kind of D.C.'s class, they fell by about 8%. So D.C.'s murder rate fell by about 3 times faster last year than the national average, going down to a rate of about 23.5 per 100,000 people. That's D.C.'s lowest rate since 1967. And if you go beyond that, you know, we can go and look to see what's happened even this year. The drop has continued. So what I've done in this chart is just compared for the first 7 months of the year, because I have all the different crime data for the first 7 months. And crimes vary over the course of the year. A lot more crimes during the summer and not so much during winters. So you want to compare apples to apples. So this is the first 7 months of 07, 08, 09, and 010. And you can see the first 7 months of 07, 104 murders, 08, 107, and then last year fell to 82, and then this year it's gone down to 69. So that's a 36% drop in 2 years that we've seen in DC. I can only guess if DC had seen a 36% increase in murders and other violent crimes after the handgun ban had been eliminated, that would be major news coverage. But the fact that we've seen this huge drop, that's not seen in the rest of the United States, has gotten virtually no news coverage. And you can also compare it to other violent crimes. If you look at robbery with guns, that fell by over 10%, about 11%. Robberies without guns fell by 3%. Aggravated assaults with guns fell by 24%. Aggravated assaults without guns fell by 8%. So crimes with guns, despite the ban being eliminated and the gun lock rules being stopped, fell by about 3 times faster than crimes without guns. And you can look at Chicago here. Chicago's ban went into effect in November 1982. You can see Chicago's murder rate relative to other top 10 cities was falling prior to the ban. Basically reached a minimum right before the ban was started, and then it rose, and it basically continued to rise. You can compare it to the other 50 largest cities, again, similar pattern. You can look at it compared to the 5 counties that are adjacent to Chicago. Chicago's murder rate was falling, and then as soon as the ban was imposed, it started to rise relative to the adjacent counties. Not all the counties report crime data for '84, so there's missing value there, but you can see, obviously, there's a change that occurred there, and you can look at it compared to the United States as a whole. Murder rates were clearly falling in Chicago relative to the United States, right up until the ban was imposed, and then it increased. A very substantial increase, even right away after the ban was imposed. Now, I'm not going to go and argue that any one particular country, proves a lot here. There are lots of other factors that one can talk about here, but at least, and I do try to control for the hundreds of factors that I control for my book, More Guns, Less Crime, but even after controlling for them, you still see Chicago and Washington, D.C. showing these increases. I'm just trying to show you very simple comparisons by showing how their murder rates, and I can show you their violent crime rates, rose relative to other similar cities. Well, how about around the world? How about island nations? I'll just show you a few graphs from island nations here after they had their bans. Ireland's ban went into effect at the beginning of '72, and you can see prior to the ban, Ireland's murder rate was pretty much bouncing down around here, just between 0.1 and 0.6 per 100,000 people, right up until the ban went into effect, and then it soared up, and obviously at a much higher rate after the ban than it was before. You can see a similar pattern for Jamaica. Now obviously somebody can go and point to, they can say, well, we have worse drug wars afterwards than before, and I'm more than happy to say that there are differences that are occurring here. But it surely didn't stop the problems that they were having there. And the fact that this, even if you think you can come up with a story in 1 or 2 of these places, the fact that it's so consistent should be concerned. And here's England and Wales. You can see their handgun ban went into effect in January 1997. Murder rates were homicides were fairly flat right up until then, and then they gradually start to rise. There's been some reduction in the last year. In 2009, the data just came out, but it's still above what it was before the ban was instituted on a per capita rate. So we've talked a little bit about who obeys these gun-free zones. So I've kind of skipped that, but what's Bill Landis at the University of Chicago and I looked at all the multiple victim public shootings from 1977 through 1999. My third edition of More Guns, Less Crime updates that discussion some. But there are a couple interesting things I think we found. One of the things is that law enforcement, while law enforcement is probably the key, for police in particular, are the key factor for controlling crime generally, they seem to have virtually no effect on multiple victim public shootings. No statistically significant effect. And the question is why? And we think we have a pretty simple answer for what's going on there. And that is, when you look at this, 75% of these guys who committed these multiple victim public shootings died at the crime scene, either by committing suicide or being killed by somebody else who has a gun. And in interviews that have been done with at least a lot of the 25% who lived, one of the common things that come out is even they expected to die. What happened was they just weren't able to go and bring themselves to commit suicide when they actually had to go and do it. They couldn't actually kill themselves. So why is this important for what impact law enforcement has? Because arrest rates, conviction rates, prison sentence lengths, the death penalty, all those affect murder rates generally or other violent crimes. The reason why they don't affect these multiple victim public shootings is because law enforcement works by punishing people after the fact. And if people believe with virtual certainty that they're going to die before they engage in these attacks, the fact that you're threatening them with more certain or more severe punishment afterwards really doesn't do very much to them in terms of convincing them not to do it. Now, one of the things that was also interesting is the huge impact Bill and I found from right to carry laws on multiple victim public shootings. We looked at 13 different types of gun control laws. We had demographic variables, poverty, income, education, you name it, hundreds of factors that were there. But of the 13 types of gun control laws that we looked at, the only one that seemed to have any statistical impact on multiple victim public shootings was the passage of right to carry laws, and it was huge. Basically, after states pass these laws, there's about a 60% drop in the number of multiple victim public shootings, the rate, and there's a 79% drop in the rate at which people are killed or injured from these attacks. But if you look at murders generally, there's only about a 1.5% drop in murder rates for each additional year that the laws are in effect. Why is it so much bigger for this particular type of crime? And again, it's pretty simple. It's just a question of deterrence. What I and other researchers find is that as the probability that you're going to be able to stop a criminal increases, you can see them commit less crimes. And so in this case, let's say I have 5% of the adult population with concealed handgun permits. If you're talking about a place that in a dark alley or a parking lot where there's one victim and a criminal comes up to them, that represents some risk to the criminal, and you see some deterrence. But in this room, I suppose, we have like 120 people or 100 plus people in this room and the overflow in the back. Even if there was only a couple % chance that any one individual here had a concealed handgun permit, assuming the probabilities were independent, what would be the probability that at least one person would have a concealed handgun? Probability would be 100%, right? And in fact, it'd probably be over 100% that you would have more than 2 people with permit concealed handguns. 2 people who would be unknown to the attacker about whether or not the people were going to be able to go and defend themselves or not. And so you see this much greater reduction in the rate at which these crimes occur compared to murders generally, simply because the probability that somebody's going to be there to stop these attacks is so much greater. And I'll just mention one other thing. What seems to be in the mind, these warped minds of the people who go and do these attacks, is they want to commit suicide. And in committing suicide, they want to do it in some way that's going to go and get attention for themselves. So they like the fact that people will be talking about them or showing them attention after they die. And you see this over and over again when you read the notes or diaries or other things that these guys leave behind, and that is they care about the amount of attention. They know how much attention other attacks have gotten in the past. They know that they're more likely to get more attention in the press the more people they kill or injure. And many of these warped minds, their goal is if they can get more killings than past attacks have done, then they're going to be guaranteed more news coverage and kind of a note in the history books that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten. And so there are issues here about how news coverage and other things affect the rate at which these attacks occur. Now there's some other things we can bring up here. One of the things that I think is very interesting is to look at Israel. Israel has had a long history of terrorist attacks, obviously. And look at the policies that they followed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and very early 1970s. What they tried to do was to put more police or more military on the street, with the notion if they just flooded the area with enough uniformed people with guns, that would stop these attacks from occurring. But the problem that they eventually realized was that was a hopeless goal. And the reason why it was is because terrorists have a huge strategic advantage in engaging in these attacks. And that strategic advantage is they have the control over when the attack occurs. And so, let's say you're on a bus, a terrorist is on a bus, and you have two police officers or two soldiers that are on the bus. What are the two options that the terrorist has? The terrorist can either outwait the soldiers. Soldiers could be on there for 6 hours, and then as soon as they leave, the terrorist could go and engage.